In the quiet village of St. Mary Mead, a respected judge is found dead, stabbed in his chambers with his own letter opener. For suspects, a nervous clerk, a cold-hearted widow, a loyal bailiff, and a cunning lawyer hide secrets that could unravel the truth. Enter Miss Jane Marple, whose sharp mind and keen eye for human nature uncover a web of ambition, betrayal, and a deadly land dispute. As alibis crumble and clues emerge, a scratched desk, a torn note, a damning memo, killer's identity comes to light. Will justice prevail in this tale of murder and deception? Chapter 1. The scene of the crime. The autumn light filtered through the tall windows of St. Mary Mead's courthouse, casting long golden bars across the polished oak floors. The building, a sturdy relic of Georgian architecture, stood at the heart of the village, its clock tower chiming with a measured dignity that belied the chaos unfolding within. In the judge's chambers on the second floor, a scene of quiet horror awaited discovery. Judge Harold Winthrop, a man whose name commanded both respect and trepidation, lay slumped across his desk, his face pressed against a leather blotter, a silver-handled letter opener buried deep in his back. The discovery was made shortly after noon by Mr. Timothy Finch, the judge's clerk, a wiry man whose spectacles perpetually slipped down his nose. He had entered the chambers to deliver a bundle of case files, only to freeze in the doorway, his breath catching in a sharp gasp. The room was silent, save for the faint tick of a mantel clock and the distant murmur of the village beyond the window. Finch's hands trembled as he backed away, his voice cracking as he called for help. Within minutes, the courthouse stirred with urgency, footsteps echoing along the corridors as constables and staff converged. Miss Jane Marple, that unassuming yet formidable spinster of St. Mary Mead, was not among the first to arrive. She was, in fact, sipping tea at the vicarage, where she had come to spend a fortnight with her nephew, Inspector Raymond West, who was temporarily stationed in the county. Raymond, a man of modern ideas and restless energy, had mentioned the judge's reputation over breakfast. A brilliant legal mind, unyielding in his principles, but with a temper that could unsettle even the boldest barrister. Miss Marple had listened with her usual quiet attentiveness, her fingers busy with her knitting, her mind already noting the undercurrents in Raymond's words. When a breathless messenger interrupted their meal with news of the murder, she set down her needles with a sigh, her eyes gleaming with a curiosity she could not quite conceal. By the time Miss Marple and Raymond reached the courthouse, the scene had been secured. A young constable, his face pale, stood guard at the chamber door, while inside, Dr. Haydock, the local physician, confirmed what was already evident. Judge Winthrop was dead, killed by a single, forceful stab wound. The room itself was a study in order, its austerity reflecting the judge's disciplined nature. Bookshelves lined with legal tomes stood sentinel along the walls, their spines aligned with military precision. A mahogany desk dominated the center, its surface bearing only a neat stack of papers. A silver inkstand, and a porcelain teacup, its contents half drunk and cold. The letter opener, an elegant piece engraved with the judge's initials, was the sole intrusion into this meticulous world, its blade now stained with tragedy. Miss Marple lingered at the threshold, her small figure almost lost in the bustle of officialdom. She wore her customary black lace mittens and a tweed coat, her white hair tucked neatly beneath a sensible hat. To the casual observer, she was merely an elderly visitor, perhaps a curious villager, drawn by the commotion. But her eyes, bright and bird-like, missed nothing. She noted the absence of overturned furniture, the undisturbed curtains, the window, latched firmly from within. No signs of a struggle, no evidence of an intruder forcing entry. The judge, it seemed, had admitted his killer willingly, perhaps even sat at his desk in conversation, before the fatal blow was struck. Raymond, pacing the room with his notebook in hand, muttered about the audacity of the crime. To kill a judge in his own chambers, in broad daylight, he said, shaking his head. It's brazen, Aunt Jane. Whoever did this knew the judge's habits, his routines. Miss Marple nodded absently, her gaze settling on the teacup. Its saucer bore a faint ring, as if placed down carelessly, a small imperfection in an otherwise pristine setting. She wondered if the judge had been drinking alone, or if his visitor had shared the moment, perhaps lulling him into a false sense of ease. Dr. Haddock emerged from his examination, wiping his hands on a handkerchief. Death was instantaneous, he said gruffly. The blade pierced the heart. Whoever wielded it had strength and precision. Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. Strength, yes, but also opportunity. The letter opener was not a weapon of chance, it was the judge's own, kept on his desk for years, a gift from a long-ago colleague. Its use suggested familiarity, even intimacy. As the constables began their methodical search, Miss Marple stepped closer to the desk, her movements slow and deliberate. She noticed a single sheet of paper, slightly askew beneath the judge's arm, its edge curling as if it had been hastily replaced. The text was dense with legal jargon, a draft ruling for an upcoming case, but a faint pencil mark circled a paragraph near the bottom. She could not read it without disturbing the scene, but the mark itself intrigued her. Had the judge been interrupted mid-thought, or had his killer seen something in those words worth concealing? Raymond called her attention to the door, where Timothy Finch hovered, his face still ashen. He's in a state, Raymond said quietly. Claims he heard nothing, saw nothing, until he found the body. But he's the closest thing to a witness we have. Miss Marple glanced at Finch, noting the way his fingers twisted the hem of his jacket, the nervous dart of his eyes. Shock, perhaps, but there was something else, a flicker of unease, that went beyond the horror of the moment. The village clock struck 1, its chime rolling through the open window. Miss Marple adjusted her shawl, her mind already turning over the fragments of the scene, the orderly room, the personal weapon, the unmarked door, the solitary teacup. Somewhere in these details lay the truth, as they always did. A dreadful business, Raymond, she said softly, her voice carrying the weight of experience. But people are so very careless, aren't they? They leave little traces, even when they think they've been clever. As they descended the courthouse steps, the murmur of St. Mary Mead greeted them, its tranquil facade unbroken by the violence within. But Miss Marple knew better. Beneath the surface of every village lay secrets, and in the death of Judge Winthrop, she sensed a tangle of motives waiting to be unraveled. Her needles would click again tonight, and with them, her thoughts would weave a pattern only she could see. Chapter 2. The suspects assembled. The library of St. Mary Mead's courthouse was a somber chamber, its high ceilings and dark wood paneling lending an air of gravitas that seemed to press down on the small assembly gathered within. The room smelled faintly of old books and wax polish, with shelves groaning under the weight of legal volumes that had not been touched in years. A long mahogany table dominated the center, surrounded by high-backed chairs, their leather cushions worn smooth by decades of use. The late afternoon sun filtered through heavy velvet curtains, casting a muted glow across the faces of the 4 individuals summoned by Inspector Raymond West. Each sat apart, as if wary of proximity, their expressions a study in contrasts, grief, unease, defiance, and guarded calm. At the room's edge, Miss Jane Marple stood quietly, her small figure almost swallowed by the shadows, her knitting needles clicking softly in a rhythm that seemed to measure the tension in the air. Inspector West stood at the head of the table, his notebook open, his manner brisk but tempered by the gravity of the occasion. He was a man in his early 40s, with sharp features and a restlessness that betrayed his city upbringing. His years in Scotland Yard had honed his instincts, but he knew better than to dismiss his aunt's unerring knack for seeing what others missed. "We are here," he began, his voice steady, "to discuss the tragic death of Judge Harold Winthrop. Each of you was closely connected to him, and I must ask for your full cooperation. This is a murder investigation, and no detail is too small." Miss Marple's eyes, bright and observant behind her spectacles, moved from one suspect to another. She had declined a seat at the table, preferring to stand near a bookcase where she could watch without drawing attention. Her black lace mittens moved deftly, the soft clack of her needles a counterpoint to Raymond's questions. She noted the way each suspect held themselves, the small gestures that betrayed more than their words might. In her experience, people revealed themselves most when they thought themselves unobsessed. First was Mr. Timothy Finch, the judge's clerk, a man whose nervous energy seemed to hum beneath his pale skin. He was in his mid-30s, slight of build, with thinning brown hair and spectacles that he adjusted constantly, as if they were a shield against scrutiny. His suit, though neat, was slightly frayed at the cuffs, and his tie was knotted with a precision that suggested habit rather than care. He sat with his hands clasped tightly, his fingers twitching as if longing to smooth some invisible crease. Miss Marple noticed a faint ink stain on his thumb, a mark of his trade, and the way his eyes darted to the door, as if he longed to flee. The room's oppressive weight. Beside him, though at a careful distance, sat Mrs. Eleanor Winthrop, the judge's widow. She was a striking woman, nearing 50, with high cheekbones and dark hair swept into an elegant chignon. Her black dress, though mourning appropriate, was tailored with an understated elegance that spoke of wealth and taste. Her face was composed, her lips pressed into a thin line, but her eyes redrimmed, yet dry, held a coldness that intrigued Miss Marple. Eleanor's hands rested in her lap, motionless, as if she had trained herself to betray nothing. Yet the slight tremor in her fingers, barely perceptible, suggested a storm beneath the surface. Miss Marple wondered what lay behind that icy facade: grief, guilt, or something sharper. Sergeant Robert Hale, the bailiff, occupied the next chair, his broad shoulders straining against the seams of his uniform. He was a man of imposing presence, with a ruddy complexion and hands that bore the calluses of manual labor. His graying hair was cropped short, and his jaw was set in a way that suggested stubborn loyalty rather than cunning. Yet his eyes, a pale blue, shifted restlessly, and he tugged at his collar as if it choked him. Miss Marple noted the faint scent of tobacco clinging to him, a detail that aligned with his role as the courthouse's steadfast guardian. But his unease, she thought, was more than the discomfort of a man unused to scrutiny. It was the unease of one who knew more than he wished to say. Finally, there was Mr. Lawrence Carver, the judge's lawyer, a man whose polished exterior seemed almost too perfect for the provincial setting of St. Mary Mead. He was in his late 40s, with dark hair slicked back and a suit that spoke of London tailors. His voice, when he spoke, was smooth and measured, each word chosen with the care of a man accustomed to swaying juries. He sat with an easy confidence, one leg crossed over the other, his hands folded calmly on the table. Yet, Miss Marple's keen gaze caught the slight tightening of his jaw. When Raymond mentioned the murder weapon, it was a fleeting gesture, but to her, it was as loud as a shout. Raymond cleared his throat, drawing their attention. "Let us begin with the facts. Judge Winthrop was found at approximately noon, stabbed in his chambers with his own letter opener. There was no sign of forced entry, suggesting the killer was someone he knew and trusted. Each of you had access to the courthouse, and each of you had a relationship with the judge. I need to know your movements this morning, and I urge you to be precise." Timothy Finch spoke first, his voice high and unsteady. "I was in the clerk's office, as always," he said, pushing his spectacles up his nose. "I had a stack of files to organize case notes for next week's hearings. I didn't hear anything unusual, just the usual sounds of the courthouse. The judge was in his chambers all morning, working on a ruling. I only went in to deliver some documents, and that's when I found him." His voice broke, and he looked down, his hands twisting together. Miss Marple's needles paused for a moment. Finch's account was plausible, but his nervousness was excessive, even for one who had discovered a body. She wondered if it was the shock of the moment, or something deeper, fear of being implicated, perhaps, or knowledge of something he dared not share. She made a mental note to ask Raymond about the clerk's routine, particularly how often he entered the judge's chambers unannounced. Raymond turned to Mrs. Winthrop, his tone softening slightly. "Mrs. Winthrop, can you tell us where you were this morning?" Eleanor's eyes met his, unblinking. "I was at home," she said, her voice clear and clipped. "I spent the morning in the garden, tending to the roses. Harold left for the courthouse at 8, as he always did. I didn't see him after that." She paused, then added, "I'm sure the servants can confirm I was there." Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. The statement was delivered with the precision of a prepared speech, and the mention of servants felt like an afterthought, a shield against further questions. She recalled a passing remark from Mrs. Bantry, a friend in the village, who had seen Eleanor walking toward the high street that morning, her manner brisk and purposeful. The discrepancy was small, but significant. A woman gardening in autumn would have dirt on her hands, perhaps a smudge on her dress, yet Eleanor's appearance was immaculate. Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythm, her mind turning over the widow's words. Sergeant Hale was next, his voice gruff and reluctant. "I was at my post outside the judge's chambers most of the morning," he said, his hands resting heavily on the table. "I keep an eye on who comes and goes. No one unusual entered, just the usual staff. I stepped out for a smoke around 11, maybe 5 minutes, no more. When I came back, everything seemed normal. I didn't know anything was wrong until Finch started shouting." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. Hale's account was straightforward, but the timing of his absence was convenient, leaving the judge vulnerable. She noted the way his fingers drummed briefly on the table, a gesture of unease that belied his gruff confidence. A bailiff's duty was to protect, yet Hale had left his post, however briefly. Was it habit, or had something him away? She resolved to inquire about the courthouse's routines, particularly the bailiff's habits. Finally, Raymond turned to Lawrence Carver, who leaned forward slightly, his expression one of practiced sorrow. "A terrible loss," Carver began, his voice smooth as polished wood. "I was in my office across town, preparing for a case. I hadn't seen Harold since yesterday, when we discussed a land dispute hearing. He was his usual self, focused, resolute. I only learned of his death when your constable arrived." Miss Marple watched Carver closely, noting the careful modulation of his tone, the way his hands remained still, betraying no nervous tics. His alibi was tidy, almost too tidy, and his mention of the land dispute piqued her interest. She had heard whispers in the village about a contentious case involving a wealthy developer, a man whose ambitions had stirred unrest among the locals. Carver's role as the judge's lawyer placed him at the heart of that storm, and Miss Marple wondered what pressures such a case might exert on a man of ambition. Raymond jotted notes, his brow furrowed. "Thank you," he said, his tone neutral. "We'll need to verify these accounts, of course. In the meantime, I ask that you remain in St. Mary Mead and make yourselves available for further questions." As the suspects rose to leave, Miss Marple observed their departures. Finch hurried out, his head bowed, as if eager to escape scrutiny. Eleanor moved with measured grace, her face a mask of composure, but her hand lingered on the doorframe, a brief hesitation that spoke of inner turmoil. Hale lumbered out, his shoulders hunched, muttering something about checking the courthouse locks. Carver was the last to leave, pausing to offer Raymond a handshake and a murmured condolence, his eyes lingering on the inspector with a calculating intensity. Miss Marple remained in the library, her knitting folded neatly in her lap. Raymond joined her, his expression one of frustration. "They're all holding something back," he said, running a hand through his hair. Finch is a nervous wreck. Eleanor's too controlled, Hale's too vague, and Carver's too smooth. But we've no evidence yet, just their word. Miss Marple smiled faintly, her eyes distant. People are rarely as clever as they think, Raymond, she said, her voice soft but firm. They leave traces, in their words, their gestures, their silences. Mr. Finch, for instance, his nervousness is not just shock. He's afraid of something specific, perhaps something he saw or heard. Mrs. Winthrop's composure is admirable, but it's a wall, not a window. Sergeant Hale's absence from his post is troubling, and Mr. Carver, well, he speaks as if he's already in court, defending himself. Raymond raised an eyebrow, a hint of amusement in his eyes. You see, all that in a few minutes' conversation. I see what people show me, Miss Marple replied, her needles clicking once more. And people, my dear, are never quite as opaque as they believe. She rose, adjusting her shawl, her mind already sifting through the morning's observations. The library, with its heavy air and silent secrets, had given her the first threads of the mystery. The judge's death was no random act. It was personal, deliberate, born of a motive rooted in the lives of those who knew him best. As she stepped into the fading light of the courthouse corridor, Miss Marple felt the familiar stir of curiosity. The truth lay hidden, but not for long, not if she could help it. Chapter 3. The Clerk's Tale. The morning after the gathering in the courthouse library, St. Mary Mead awoke to a drizzle that cloaked the village in a soft, gray veil. The courthouse itself stood somber against the damp sky, its clock tower ticking with mechanical indifference. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of ink and old wood, and the corridors echoed with the muted footsteps of clerks and constables. Miss Jane Marple, undeterred by the weather, made her way to the courthouse. With a purposeful step, her umbrella shielding her neat tweed coat, she had promised her nephew, Inspector Raymond West, to observe the morning's interviews, though she suspected her true purpose was to listen for what was not said. The clerk's office, a cramped room adjacent to the judge's chambers, was Timothy Finch's domain. It was a space of relentless order, with filing cabinets lining the walls, and a desk buried under stacks of meticulously labeled folders. The only concession to personality was a small potted fern, its leaves drooping slightly, as if sharing its owner's unease. Finch sat behind the desk, his spectacles glinting in the light of a single lamp, his fingers fidgeting with a pen. He looked up as Raymond entered, followed by Miss Marple, who settled quietly into a chair near the door. Her knitting already in hand, Raymond took the lead, his tone brisk but not unkind. Mr. Finch, we need to go over your account again. You were the one to find Judge Winthrop, and your proximity to the crime makes your statement critical. Let's start with yesterday morning. Walk me through your routine, and don't leave anything out. Finch swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing visibly. It was a normal day, he began, his voice thin and wavering. I arrived at 7:30, as I always do. The judge was already in his chambers. He liked to start early. I spent the morning sorting case files and typing up notes for next week's hearings. He'd asked for the documents on the land dispute case, so I was preparing those. I didn't see or hear anything unusual until I went in to deliver them. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, her eyes fixed on Finch's hands. The pen he clutched was twisted so tightly that his knuckles were white, and a faint tremor ran through his fingers. She noted the ink stains on his cuffs, fresher than those she'd observed the day before, suggesting he'd been working even in his distress. His nervousness was palpable, but was it the residue of shock or something more? Raymond leaned forward, his notebook open. You said you heard nothing unusual. No voices, no footsteps, no sounds from the judge's chambers. Finch shook his head, his spectacles slipping slightly. No, nothing. The walls are thick, and the judge's door was always closed. He valued his privacy. I was focused on my work. There's always so much to do. He hesitated, then added. He was particular, you know. Everything had to be just so. If a file was out of place, he'd notice. Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. The judge's exacting nature was a thread that kept surfacing, a trait that might have bred resentment in those who served him. She made a mental note to ask about Finch's relationship with his employer, but for now, she let Raymond press on. "What time did you enter the chambers?" Raymond asked. Finch's eyes flickered to the clock on the wall, as if seeking reassurance. "Just before noon. I'd finished collating the files, and I knew he'd want them before lunch. I knocked, but there was no answer. I thought he might be deep in thought. He often was, so I went in. That's when I saw him." His voice faltered, and he looked down, his hands clenching the pen until it snapped with a faint crack. Miss Marple's needles paused. The broken pen was a small thing, but it spoke of a man on edge, his control fraying under pressure. She observed the way Finch avoided Raymond's gaze, his eyes darting to the fern, the files, anywhere but the inspector's face. There was fear there, she thought, but not necessarily of guilt. It was the fear of someone caught in a web not entirely of their own making. Raymond's tone sharpened. "You were in the clerk's office all morning, then? You never left, not even for a moment?" Finch hesitated, his fingers brushing the ink-stained cuff. "Well, I might have stepped out briefly, just to the stationery cupboard down the hall. We were low on paper clips, and the judge hated running out. It was only a minute or two." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. This was a deviation from his earlier claim of constant presence. The stationery cupboard was a plausible errand, but its timing was convenient, aligning with the window of the murder. She wondered if Finch had seen something during that brief absence, something he was reluctant to share. Her needles resumed their rhythm, a steady counterpoint to the clerk's unease. Raymond jotted a note, his brow furrowed. "And when you returned, everything was as you left it." No one in the corridor, no signs of anyone near the judge's chambers. "No one," Finch said quickly, too quickly. It was quiet. The courthouse isn't busy in the mornings, not like market days. Just the usual staff, me, Sergeant Hale, a few cleaners. Miss Marple tilted her head, her mind turning over the clerk's words. The courthouse's quietness was significant. A stranger would have stood out, reinforcing the likelihood that the killer was someone familiar. She recalled a passing remark from Mrs. Bantry, who had mentioned seeing Finch in the village square the previous day, carrying a parcel from the stationer's. If true, that errand had taken longer than a minute or two. She resolved to verify the timing, perhaps with the stationer himself. Raymond shifted tack. "Tell me about the judge. What was he like to work for? Any tensions? Any disagreements?" Finch's face tightened, a flicker of something resentment, perhaps, crossing his features. "He was demanding," he said carefully. "He expected precision, always. If a document wasn't perfect, he'd send it back. He wasn't unkind, exactly, but he didn't suffer mistakes. I tried to meet his standards, but it wasn't always easy." He paused, then added, almost as an afterthought, "He'd been more on edge lately though, snappish, even with me." Miss Marple. Needle slowed. The judge's irritability was a recurring theme, mentioned by both Finch and Hale. She wondered what had unsettled a man known for his composure. Was it the pressure of the land dispute case, or something more personal? She made a mental note to explore the judge's recent behavior, perhaps through the village's ever-reliable gossip network. Raymond leaned back, studying Finch. "Did you ever argue with him, or notice anyone else who did?" Finch's eyes widened, and he shook his head vigorously. "Argue? No, never. I respected him. He was brilliant, really. As for others, well, people disagreed with him sometimes. Lawyers, mostly. Mr. Carver was in the chambers a lot, going over cases. I heard raised voices once or twice, but that's normal, isn't it? Legal matters get heated. Miss Marple's interest sharpened at the mention of Carver. The lawyer's name had surfaced again, tied to the judge's chambers and potential conflict. She noted Finch's quick deflection, as if eager to shift attention from himself. His loyalty to the judge seemed genuine, but his nervousness suggested he knew more than he was willing to say. Was he protecting someone, or merely afraid of being implicated? Raymond closed his notebook, his expression unreadable. "Thank you, Mr. Finch. We'll speak again. For now, don't leave the village, and let us know if you remember anything else." Finch nodded, his relief palpable as he stood, his chair scraping against the floor. He adjusted his spectacles once more, his hands lingering on the desk as if reluctant to leave its shelter. Miss Marple watched him go, her mind cataloging the small inconsistencies in his story, the broken pen, the ink-stained cuffs, the hesitant admission of his errand. They were threads, fragile but telling, and she knew better than to dismiss them. As the door closed behind Finch, Raymond turned to his aunt, his voice low. "He's hiding something, isn't he? That business about the stationery cupboard feels off." Miss Marple folded her knitting, her eyes thoughtful. "Oh, yes, Raymond. Mr. Finch is a bundle of nerves, but not, I think, because he's guilty. He's like young Thomas at the vicarage, who broke a window and spent days dreading discovery. It's fear of consequence, not necessarily of crime. He may have seen or heard something he doesn't want to admit, perhaps because it implicates someone he knows." Raymond raised an eyebrow, a hint of skepticism in his smile. "You're reading a lot into a broken pen and a shaky voice, Aunt Jane." "People are books, my dear," she replied, her tone gentle but firm. "You just need to know how to read them. Mr. Finch's pages are crumpled, but they're not blank. We must find out what he's so afraid of revealing." She rose, smoothing her coat, her mind already turning to the next thread in the tapestry, Judge's widow, whose icy composure hid a story of its own. The drizzle outside had thickened, but Miss Marple's resolve was unshaken. The truth, she knew, was like the rain, persistent, inevitable, and bound to leave traces. Chapter 4. The wife's burden. The drizzle of the previous day had given way to a sharp, clear morning, the kind that made St. Mary Mead's cobbled streets glisten and its gardens seemed to hold their breath. Miss Jane Marple, wrapped in a woolen shawl against the autumn chill, walked briskly toward the Winthrop residence, a handsome Georgian house set back from the village green. Its ivy-clad facade and manicured lawn spoke of wealth and restraint, but Miss Marple's keen eyes noted the drawn curtains and the absence of the usual bustle of servants. The house, like its mistress, seemed to guard its secrets closely. Inspector Raymond West had arranged to interview Mrs. Eleanor Winthrop at home, a courtesy extended to the widow of a prominent man. Miss Marple accompanied him, ostensibly as a sympathetic presence, though Raymond knew better than to underestimate her purpose. She carried her knitting bag, the soft clack of her needles a familiar companion, as they were shown into the drawing room by a somber housemaid. The room was elegant but cold, with heavy brocade curtains and a marble fireplace unlit despite the morning's chill. A vase of roses, their petals beginning to curl, stood on a side table, their scent mingling with the faint tang of furniture. Polished. Eleanor Winthrop entered with the grace of a woman accustomed to scrutiny. She wore a black silk dress, its cut severe yet flattering, and her dark hair was pinned with precision. Her face, pale and composed, betrayed no trace of the grief one might expect, though her eyes were shadowed, as if sleep had eluded her. She gestured for them to sit, choosing a high-backed chair for herself, her posture rigid as if braced for battle. "Inspector West," she said, her voice low and measured, "I trust you're making progress. This is a dreadful time, and I wish to see justice done." Raymond nodded, his notebook already open. "We appreciate your cooperation, Mrs. Winthrop." Let's go over your movements yesterday morning. You told us you were at home, gardening. Can you provide more detail? Eleanor's lips tightened briefly, a flicker of irritation, or perhaps caution. Certainly, she said. I was in the garden from about 9 o'clock. I was pruning the roses. Harold always admired them, though he rarely had time to notice. I didn't leave the property until after the news came. The maids were about, though I doubt they were watching me closely. I prefer solitude when I garden. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, her eyes resting on Eleanor's hands. They were pale and unblemished, the nails neatly trimmed, with no trace of soil or the roughness one might expect from pruning thorny roses. She recalled Mrs. Bantry's remark about seeing Eleanor in the village square. Near the post office, around 10 that morning, her manner hurried and her coat buttoned against the drizzle. The discrepancy was subtle but significant, and Miss Marple wondered if Eleanor's gardening was as much a story as a task. Raymond's tone remained even. Can anyone confirm you were here? A servant, perhaps? Or a neighbor? Eleanor's eyes flickered, but her voice held steady. The maids were in the kitchen, I believe. Mrs. Collins, the cook, might have seen me through the window. As for neighbors, I don't make a habit of parading my activities. This is a private house, Inspector. Miss Marple noted the defensiveness in her tone, a crack in the polished surface. Eleanor's composure was formidable, but it was not impenetrable. She made a mental note to speak with Mrs. Collins, whose kitchen window overlooked the garden. A cook, in her experience, was often a fount of unguarded observations, especially in a village like St. Mary Mead, where gossip flowed as freely as tea. Raymond pressed on. Tell me about your relationship with your husband. You mentioned yesterday that your marriage was strained. Can you elaborate? Eleanor's fingers tightened briefly on the arm of her chair, the first visible sign of discomfort. Harold was a man of duty, she said, her voice cool but deliberate. His work consumed him, cases, rulings, the law. He was rarely home, and when he was, his mind was elsewhere. We lived separate lives, Inspector, as many couples do after years of marriage, but I respected him, and I believe he respected me. Miss Marple's needle slowed, her mind turning over Eleanor's words. The phrase separate lives was telling, suggesting not just distance, but a deliberate separation of worlds. She wondered what filled Eleanor's days, what secrets she kept in the shadow of her husband's prominence. The roses on the table, wilting despite their beauty, seemed a metaphor for the marriage itself, carefully tended, yet fading. Raymond's pen scratched across his notebook. Were there any recent disagreements? Anything that might have upset him, or you? Eleanor's gaze hardened, though her expression remained serene. Disagreements, no more than usual. Harold could be difficult. His temper had grown sharper lately, especially about his work. He mentioned a case troubling him, something about land and developers, but he didn't share details. He never did. I learned long ago not to pry. Miss Marple's interest sharpened at the mention of the land dispute case, the same one that had surfaced in Finch's and Carver's accounts. The judge's irritability, it seemed, was not confined to his staff, but had seeped into his home. She wondered if Eleanor's detachment was genuine, or a shield against deeper wounds, perhaps infidelity, neglect, or something more sinister. Her eyes drifted to a photograph on the mantel, showing a younger Eleanor and Harold, their smiles, stiff and formal. The distance between them, even in the image, was palpable. Raymond shifted tack. Did you visit the courthouse yesterday, Mrs. Winthrop, even briefly? Eleanor's eyes met his, unblinking. No, she said firmly. I had no reason to. Harold preferred to keep his work separate from our home life. I haven't been to the courthouse in months. Miss Marple's needles paused. The denial was swift, almost rehearsed, and it clashed with Mrs. Bantry's sighting of Eleanor in the village, not far from the courthouse. She recalled another tidbit from the village grapevine. A neighbor had seen Eleanor's car parked near the high street, its engine running, as if waiting for someone. The discrepancy was growing, and Miss Marple resolved to visit Mrs. Bantry for a fuller account. Raymond leaned forward, his tone gentle but probing. "Mrs. Winthrop, forgive me, but I must ask, did you have any reason to wish your husband harm, or know of anyone who did?" Eleanor's face stiffened, a flash of anger breaking through her composure. "That's an outrageous question, Inspector," she said, her voice sharp. "Harold was my husband. I mourn his loss, as any wife would. As for enemies, he was a judge. His rulings made him unpopular with some, I'm sure. You'd do better to look at those who lost in his courtroom than to question me." Miss Marple noted the sudden heat in Eleanor's words, a departure from her earlier restraint. The mention of enemies was a deflection, but it held a kernel of truth. The judge's rulings, particularly in the land dispute case, had stirred controversy, and Miss Marple wondered if Eleanor knew more about those tensions than she let on. Her knitting resumed, the needles moving with a steady rhythm that belied the quickness of her thoughts. Raymond closed his notebook, his expression neutral. "Thank you, Mrs. Winthrop. We'll need to speak with your staff to confirm your account. Please remain available for further questions." Eleanor rose, her movements graceful but deliberate. "Of course," she said, her tone regaining its icy calm. "I want this matter resolved as much as you do." She escorted them to the door, her hand lingering on the knob, as if reluctant to let them leave or perhaps to ensure they did. Outside, the morning air was crisp, the village green bustling with early shoppers. Raymond turned to Miss Marple, his brow furrowed. "She's hiding something, isn't she? That story about gardening doesn't add up, not with what Mrs. Bantry saw." Miss Marple adjusted her shawl, her eyes distant. "Oh, yes, Raymond. Mrs. Winthrop is a woman who knows how to present herself, but her story has cracks. The roses, for instance, no dirt on her hands, no gardening gloves in sight, and her anger at your last question was telling. She's protecting something, perhaps not herself, but someone or something she values." Raymond sighed, a hint of frustration in his voice. "You see more in a pair of clean hands than I do in a dozen interviews, Aunt Jane." Miss Marple smiled faintly, her needles tucked safely in her bag. "Hands tell stories, my dear. So do eyes and silences. Mrs. Winthrop's are speaking loudly, if you know how to listen." As they walked back toward the village, Miss Marple's mind turned over the morning's revelations. Eleanor's composure was a carefully constructed wall, but walls could be scaled, and Miss Marple was adept at finding the footholds. The land dispute case, the judge's temper, the widow's elusive mourning, these were pieces of a puzzle, and she was determined to see the picture they formed. Chapter 5. The Bailiff's Duty. The sun hung low over St. Mary Mead, painting the courthouse in hues of amber, as Miss Jane Marple and Inspector Raymond West made their way back to the scene of the crime. The drizzle had long ceased, leaving the air crisp and the cobbles slick underfoot. The courthouse, with its stern Georgian facade, stood as a silent sentinel, its clock tower marking the hours with unyielding precision. Inside, the corridors were quieter now, the initial frenzy of the murder investigation giving way to a somber routine. Miss Marple, her knitting bag slung over her arm, moved with a quiet purpose, her eyes taking in the smallest details. The scuff of a boot on the floor, the faint creak of a door left ajar. They found Sergeant Robert Hale in the guardroom near the courthouse entrance, a small utilitarian space cluttered with a desk, a coat rack, and a kettle that hissed faintly on. A gas ring. Hale was a man built like an oak, his broad frame filling the room, his uniform slightly rumpled from a long day's wear. His face, weathered and ruddy, bore the marks of years spent outdoors, and his pale blue eyes held a wariness that sharpened. As Raymond entered, he stood, brushing crumbs from his hands, a remnant of a hasty lunch, and nodded gruffly. "Inspector." "Miss Marple," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "I've been expecting you." Miss Marple settled into a wooden chair by the window, her knitting needles emerging almost at once, their soft clack a steady undertone to the conversation. She noted Hale's posture, shoulders squared, hands clasped behind his back, as if standing to attention. But there was a tension in his jaw, a faint twitch that suggested he was not as at ease as he wished to appear. The scent of tobacco clung to him, sharp and lingering, and she recalled his mention of a smoke break during the critical hour of the judge's murder. Raymond opened his notebook, his manner direct but not accusing. "Sergeant Hale, you were on duty outside Judge Winthrop's chambers yesterday morning. We need a clear account of your movements, particularly around 11 o'clock, when you say you stepped out for a smoke. Let's start there." Hale shifted, his weight, his boots scuffing the floor. "Right," he said, his tone clipped. "I was at my post from 8, when the judge arrived. My job's to keep an eye on the corridor, make sure no one bothers him unless they're expected. It was a quiet morning, nobody came by, except Finch with his files. Around 11, I needed a break. Stepped out to the courtyard for a cigarette. 5 minutes, maybe 6. When I came back, everything looked normal. Didn't know anything was wrong until Finch started hollering." Miss Marple's needles moved rhythmically, her eyes fixed on Hale's hands, which had unclasped and now rested on the desk, fingers drumming faintly. The brevity of his account was telling, as was the precision of his timing. 5 minutes was a short window, but enough for a determined killer to act, especially if they knew the bailiff's habits. She wondered how regular these smoke breaks were, and whether anyone in the courthouse had noticed a pattern. Raymond's pen scratched across the page. "You're certain it was only 5 minutes, and no one passed you in the courtyard or the corridor when you returned?" Hale's jaw tightened, and he shook his head. "No one. The courtyard's tucked away, behind the stables, not a place people wander, and the corridor was empty when I got back. I'd have noticed anyone out of place I'm paid to notice." Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. Hale's certainty was convincing, but it felt rehearsed, as if he had anticipated the question and prepared his answer. She recalled a conversation with the courthouse caretaker, Mr. Gibbs, who had mentioned Hale's fondness for lingering in the courtyard, sometimes longer than necessary, especially when the judge was in a foul mood. She made a mental note to confirm the duration of Hale's absence, perhaps through the stable boy, who often loitered nearby. Raymond leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "You mentioned the judge was irritable lately. Can you tell us more about that? Any specific incidents?" Hale hesitated, his fingers pausing their drumming. "He was under pressure," he said carefully. "The land dispute case, the one with that developer, fellow Carter or Carson, something like that. It was a big deal, lots of money at stake. The judge was snappish more than usual, barked at me a few times for no reason, told me to keep the corridor clear of loiterers, even snapped at Finch, which wasn't like him. I figured it was the case weighing on him." Miss Marple's needles slowed, her mind latching on to the mention of the land dispute case again. It was a thread that wove through every conversation: Finch's files, Eleanor's vague reference, and now Hale's observation. The judge's irritability suggested he was grappling with something significant, perhaps a discovery that threatened more than just a ruling. She wondered if Hale, stationed outside the chambers, had overheard anything revealing: raised voice, a name, a threat. Raymond's tone sharpened. "Did you ever hear the judge argue with anyone? Mr. Carver, perhaps, or someone else involved in the case?" Hale's eyes flicked to the window, then back to Raymond. "I don't eavesdrop," he said, a touch of defensiveness in his voice. "But yeah, I heard voices now and then. Carver was in there a lot, talking about the case. Sounded heated sometimes, but that's lawyers for you. Always arguing. Didn't catch details, the door's thick, and I don't make it my business to listen." Miss Marple noted the slight flush creeping up Hale's neck. His claim of ignorance was plausible, but his discomfort suggested he had heard more than he admitted. In her experience, men like Hale, loyal, practical, accustomed to routine, often absorbed more than they realized, their observations buried under layers of duty. She resolved to probe further, perhaps indirectly, through someone who knew Hale's habits, like the caretaker or the stable boy. Raymond shifted tack. "Your smoke break, Sergeant. Was it a regular habit? Did anyone know you'd be away from your post?" Hale's eyes narrowed, and he crossed his arms, his posture stiffening. "I take a break when I need one," he said gruffly. "Most days, yeah, around the same time. Keeps me sharp. Anyone who works here could have noticed, I suppose. Finch, the cleaners, maybe Carver. But I'm never gone long, and the judge didn't mind. He trusted me to do my job." Miss Marple's needles paused, her mind turning over the implications. A predictable absence, even a brief one, was an opportunity for a killer who knew the courthouse's rhythms. Hale's loyalty to the judge was evident, but his routine could have been exploited. She wondered if someone had waited for that moment, slipping into the chambers while the bailiff was distracted by his cigarette. Raymond jotted a note, his expression thoughtful. "One last thing, Sergeant. Did you notice anything unusual in the days leading up to the murder? Anything out of the ordinary about the judge or the courthouse?" Hale rubbed his jaw, his eyes distant. "Can't say I did," he said slowly, "though. The judge was working late more often. Saw his light on past 8, a few nights last week. And there was a fellow hanging about the courtyard one evening, not staff. Didn't get a good look, too dark. Thought he might be a lawyer's clerk, but he was gone quick." Miss Marple's interest sharpened. A stranger in the courtyard was a new detail, one that could shift the investigation's focus. She made a mental note to ask Mr. Gibbs about any unfamiliar faces around the courthouse, particularly in the evenings. Hale's observation, casually offered, might be a key to unlocking the mystery. Raymond closed his notebook, his tone firm. "Thank you, Sergeant. We'll need to speak with you again. Don't leave the village, and let us know if you recall anything else." Hale nodded, his expression a mix of relief and lingering unease. He stood, adjusting his uniform, and strode to the door, his boots heavy on the floor. Miss Marple watched him go, noting the way his shoulders slumped slightly once he thought himself unobserved. Loyalty, she thought, could be a heavy burden, especially when it clashed with truth. As the door closed, Raymond turned to his aunt, his voice low. "He's not telling us everything, is he? That story about the smoke break feels too neat, and that stranger in the courtyard, why mention it now?" Miss Marple folded her knitting, her eyes thoughtful. "Sergeant Hale is a man of habit, Raymond, and habits make people predictable. He's loyal to the judge, but loyalty can blind as well as bind. He may have seen something he doesn't yet understand, or he's protecting someone out of duty. That stranger, though, that's a thread worth pulling." Raymond sighed, a wry smile tugging at his lips. "You make it sound so simple, Aunt Jane. A stranger, a smoke break, and suddenly we're closer to the truth." "It's never simple, my dear," Miss Marple replied, her voice soft but certain. "But it's always there, in the little things, people's habits, their hesitations. Sergeant Hale's story is like a well-worn coat, comfortable, but with patches that don't quite match." As they stepped into the corridor, the courthouse clock struck 4, its chime echoing through the empty halls. Miss Marple adjusted her shawl, her mind already turning to the next piece of the puzzle. Lawrence Carver, the lawyer whose polished exterior hid a web of motives. The truth, she knew, was waiting, as patient and persistent as her knitting. Chapter 6. The Lawyer's Gambit. The late afternoon light filtered through the leaded windows of St. Mary Mead's courthouse, casting a lattice of shadows across the polished floor of the upper corridor. Miss Jane Marple, her step light despite the weight of the day, followed Inspector Raymond West to a small office reserved for visiting barristers. The air carried a faint mustiness, overlaid with the sharp temps of ink and the distant murmur of village life beyond the walls. Today's interview was with Mr. Lawrence Carver, the judge's lawyer, a man whose name had surfaced in every conversation like a persistent refrain. Miss Marple's knitting bag hung at her side, its contents a quiet promise of patience, and her eyes, bright behind her spectacles, were already searching for the truths hidden in the lawyer's polished demeanor. The office was sparsely furnished, a functional space with a desk, 2 chairs, and a narrow window overlooking the courtyard. Lawrence Carver stood as they entered, his movements smooth and deliberate, like an actor stepping onto a stage. He was a man of striking presence, his dark hair slicked back, his charcoal suit tailored to a precision that seemed out of place in the provincial courthouse. His smile was measured, offering just enough warmth to be courteous without inviting familiarity. "Inspector West, Miss Marple," he said, his voice as smooth as polished mahogany. "A tragic day for St. Mary Mead. I'm at your disposal." Raymond took the lead, settling into a chair and opening his notebook with a practiced flick. "Thank you, Mr. Carver. We're piecing together Judge Winthrop's final hours, and as his lawyer, you were close to his work. Let's start with your movements. Yesterday morning." Carver leaned back, his hands folded calmly on the desk, his expression one of attentive sorrow. "Of course," he said, "I was in my office across town, preparing for a hearing in the land dispute case. I hadn't seen Harold since the previous afternoon, when we reviewed some documents. I was drafting arguments when your constable arrived with the news. A terrible shock, naturally." Miss Marple, seated near the window, began to knit, her needles clicking softly in a rhythm that seemed to pace the conversation. She noted the precision of Carver's words, each syllable chosen with care, as if he were addressing a jury rather than an inspector. His alibi was tidy, almost too tidy, and she recalled a villager's mention of seeing Carver's sleek black car near the courthouse the previous evening, its engine idling as if waiting for a clandestine meeting. Her needles moved steadily, but her mind was alert, sifting through the lawyer's measured calm for cracks. Raymond's pen scratched across the page. "You say you were across town all morning. Can anyone confirm that? Your secretary, perhaps?" Carver's smile tightened, a fleeting shadow crossing his face. "My secretary, Miss Ellis, was with me until 10, when she left for an errand. After that, I was alone, working. Clients can attest to my appointments later in the day, but the morning was quiet. I'm sure the constable's records will show when he reached me." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. The absence of a witness for the critical hours was convenient, and Carver's confidence suggested he had anticipated the question. She wondered about Miss Ellis's errand. Where had she gone, and how long had it kept her away? The lawyer's office was only a 10-minute walk from the courthouse, a distance easily covered by a man with purpose. Her needles paused briefly, then resumed, marking the rhythm of her thoughts. Raymond shifted tack. "Tell us about your relationship with Judge Winthrop. You worked closely with him, particularly on the land dispute case. Any tensions there?" Carver's expression softened, a practiced gesture of regret. Harold was a brilliant man, uncompromising in his principles. "We worked well together, though we didn't always agree. The land dispute case was complex, high stakes, powerful interests. Harold was meticulous, determined to ensure justice was served. It made him intense lately, but tension, no, nothing beyond the usual debates of legal work." Miss Marple's needles slowed. Carver's description of the judge echoed Finch's and Hale's: intense, irritable, under pressure, but his denial of tension felt too smooth, like a river stone worn by years of careful handling. She recalled Sergeant Hale's mention of raised voices between Carver and the judge, overheard through the chamber door. The lawyer's composure was formidable, but it was not infallible, and Miss Marple wondered what lay beneath his polished surface. Raymond's tone sharpened. The land dispute case keeps coming up. We understand it involved a developer, a Mr. Carson, and significant financial interests. Can you tell us more about it? Was there anything about the case that troubled the judge? Carver hesitated, his fingers brushing the edge of the desk, a gesture so slight it might have gone unnoticed by a less observant eye. The case was contentious, he admitted, his voice measured. Mr. Carson's company sought to develop a parcel of land, against local opposition. There were allegations of improper influence, bribes. You might say, though, nothing proven. Harold was reviewing evidence, preparing a ruling that would have set a precedent. He was thorough, as always, but it weighed on him. He didn't share specifics, even with me. Miss Marple's interest sharpened. The mention of bribes was new, a thread that tied the case to darker motives. She recalled a snippet of village gossip, overheard at the tea shop, about Carson's reputation for bending rules to his advantage. If the judge had uncovered evidence of corruption, it could have threatened not only Carson, but also those who facilitated his dealings, perhaps even Carver himself. Her needles clicked faster, a silent counterpoint to the lawyer's careful words. Raymond leaned forward, his eyes intent. Did you ever argue with the judge about the case? Or hear him argue with anyone else? Carver's smile returned, but it was thinner now, a blade's edge. Argue? No, Inspector. We discussed. Legal work is full of vigorous debate. Harold and I had our differences, but they were professional, never personal. As for others, I wouldn't know. Harold kept his own counsel, especially on sensitive matters. Miss Marple noted the deflection, the way Carver sidestepped the question of others while emphasizing his own harmony with the judge. She thought of Finch's nervous admission of overhearing raised voices and Hale's similar observation. Carver's presence in the chambers had been frequent, his discussions with the judge heated. Was he minimizing those encounters, or had they been routine, as he claimed? She resolved to check the courthouse log, which recorded visitors to the judge's chambers, for any pattern in Carver's visits. Raymond's pen paused. One more thing, Mr. Carver. Were you at the courthouse the evening before the murder? We've had a report of your car being seen nearby. Carver's composure faltered, a flicker of surprise crossing his face before he masked it with a chuckle. My car. I'm afraid that's a mistake, Inspector. I was at my office late, catching up on paperwork. The courthouse is a busy place perhaps. Someone mistook another car for mine. They do look similar, these modern models. Miss Marple's needle stopped entirely, her eyes fixed on Carver's face. The chuckle was too quick, the explanation too ready, and she sensed a lie, carefully wrapped in plausibility. The villager, who had seen the Cara grocer with a sharp eye for detail, had been certain of its make and color, down to the polished chrome bumper. Carver's denial only deepened her suspicion, and she made a mental note to ask Raymond to verify the sighting with other witnesses. Perhaps the stable boy who frequented the courtyard. Raymond closed his notebook, his expression unreadable. Thank you, Mr. Carver. We'll need to confirm your whereabouts, and we may have more questions. Please stay in the village. Carver rose, his smile returning, though it no longer reached his eyes. Of course, Inspector. I want this resolved as much as anyone. Harold was a friend, as well as a colleague. He extended a hand, which Raymond shook briefly, then nodded to Miss Marple, his gaze lingering a moment too long, as if assessing her. As Carver left, his footsteps echoing down the corridor, Raymond turned to his aunt, his voice low. He's slippery, isn't he? That story about his office feels rehearsed, and he dodged the question about the car. Miss Marple folded her knitting, her eyes thoughtful. Oh yes, Raymond. Mr. Carver is like a well-crafted novel, polished, engaging, but with chapters. He doesn't want us to read. His connection to the land dispute case is no coincidence, and that car sighting, it's a loose thread he can't quite tuck away. Raymond rubbed his temples, a wry smile breaking through. You make it sound like a puzzle, Aunt Jane, with all the pieces already on the table. They are, my dear, she replied, her voice soft but certain. It's only a matter of arranging them. Mr. Carver's story is too perfect, and perfection, in my experience, is often a mask. As they stepped into the fading light of the corridor, Miss Marple's mind turned to the land dispute case, its shadows lengthening with each new detail. The truth, she knew, was hidden in the interplay of motives and opportunities, and Carver's role was becoming clearer, like a figure emerging from the fog. Chapter 7. Threads of motive. The evening had settled over St. Mary Mead with a quiet that belied the undercurrents of suspicion rippling through the village. Miss Jane Marple sat in the cozy parlor of her nephew's temporary lodgings at the vicarage, a fire crackling in the grate to ward off the autumn chill. The room was softly lit by a pair of lamps, their glow casting warm shadows on the chintz curtains and the well-worn armchairs. A tray of tea and scones rested on the table, the steam rising in delicate curls, but Miss Marple's attention was elsewhere. Her knitting lay in her lap, the needles silent for once. As she sipped her tea and turned over the day's revelations in her mind, Inspector Raymond West, seated opposite, leafed through his notebook, his brow furrowed with the weight of the investigation. The fire popped, and Raymond looked up, his voice tinged with frustration. We've got 4 suspects, Aunt Jane, and each one's story has holes. Finch is a nervous wreck, Eleanor's too controlled, Hale's too vague, and Carver's too slick. But we've no hard evidence, just a tangle of alibis and half-truths. Where do we go from here? Miss Marple set down her cup, her eyes bright with the clarity of thought that always seemed to sharpen in the quiet hours. Motives, Raymond, she said softly, her voice carrying the gentle authority of experience. That's where we must look. People don't kill without reason, and Judge Winthrop's death was no accident. It was personal, deliberate, born of something that pressed hard enough to break. We must consider what drove each of them, what they stood to gain or lose. Raymond leaned back, his fingers drumming on the armrest. Fair enough. Let's start with Finch. He's the clerk, worked under the judge for years. What's his motive? Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly, her mind sifting through the clerk's nervous gestures and halting words. Mr. Finch is a man of routine, Raymond, but routine can breed resentment, especially under a master as exacting as the judge. He spoke of the judge's demands, perfection, in every file, every note. That kind of pressure can wear a man down, make him feel small. And he was afraid, more than shock alone could explain. Perhaps he feared losing his position, or perhaps he knew something about the judge's work, something dangerous. But murder? I think not. His fear is that of a witness, not a killer. Raymond nodded, jotting a note. So, Finch might know more than he's letting on, but he's not our man. What about Eleanor Winthrop? The wife's always a suspect in a case like this. Miss Marple's eyes grew thoughtful, her fingers brushing the wool in her lap. Mrs. Winthrop is a woman of pride, Raymond, and pride can hide many wounds. She spoke of a marriage grown cold, of separate lives. That distance suggests grievances, neglect, perhaps, or betrayal. Her alibi is shaky. Mrs. Bantry saw her in the village, not gardening as she claimed, and her anger when you pressed her about enemies, it was sharp, protective. She may have resented the judge, but I wonder if her motive lies elsewhere, perhaps in protecting someone or something dear to her. A lover, maybe, or a secret she fears exposure. Raymond raised an eyebrow, a hint of skepticism in his smile. A lover? That's a leap, Aunt Jane. But her alibi does bother me. Why lie about gardening unless she was somewhere she shouldn't have been? Precisely, Miss Marple said, her voice soft but firm. People lie to protect, Raymond, sometimes themselves, sometimes others. We must find out where she was, and why she hides it. She paused, her eyes distant. It reminds me of Mrs. Eldridge in the village, who claimed to be at choir practice when her husband's shop was burgled. It turned out she was meeting a cousin in trouble, not a lover. Secrets have many faces. Raymond turned a page in his notebook. Next is Hale, the bailiff. He's loyal, but that smoke break of his is awfully convenient. 5 minutes away, and the judge is dead. Motive. Miss Marple's needles stirred, a faint click resuming as she considered the burly sergeant. Sergeant Hale is a man of duty, but duty can chafe, especially under a judge who snapped at him for no reason. He mentioned the judge's irritability, and I suspect he felt undervalued, perhaps overlooked. His absence from his post was brief, but it was known. Finch, Carver, even the cleaners might have noticed his routine. A killer could have waited for it. But Hale himself, I see no gain for him in murder, unless the judge's death protected some secret of his own. That stranger he saw in the courtyard intrigues me. It may be nothing, but it may be a key. Raymond frowned, tapping his pen. That stranger's a loose end. Hale didn't mention it until pressed, which makes me wonder what else he's holding back. But you're right, murder doesn't fit him, not yet. Which leaves Carver. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed, her fingers pausing mid-stitch. Mr. Carver is the most interesting, Raymond. He's a man of ambition, polished to a fault, but ambition can lead to dangerous corners. The land dispute case is the heart of this, I think. The judge was reviewing evidence of bribery, and Carver's client, Mr. Carson, stood to lose millions if the ruling went against him. Carver's alibi is unconfirmed for the critical hours, and that car sighting near the courthouse the night before, it's a shadow he can't shake. If the judge suspected Carver of complicity in Carson's schemes, his career, his reputation, would be at stake. That's a powerful motive. Raymond leaned forward, his voice low. You think Carver's our man? The letter opener, the lack of a struggle, it points to someone the judge trusted, someone close. Miss Marple tilted her head, her expression cautious. It's possible, Raymond, but we mustn't leap too soon. Carver's motive is clear, but motives alone don't make a murderer. We need evidence, something to tie him to the chamber, to the moment. The letter opener is curious, though. It was the judge's own, kept on his desk. Why choose it, unless the act was impulsive, a moment of rage? Carver's too controlled for that, I think, unless he was cornered. Raymond closed his notebook, his eyes narrowing. The land dispute case keeps coming up. I've requested the court records, but they're slow to arrive. If the judge was about to expose bribery, it could point to Carson, or even Carver himself. We need to dig deeper into their connection. Miss Marple nodded, her fingers resuming their knitting. Yes, and we must look at the judge's papers. If he was drafting a ruling, or had notes on the bribery, they might tell us what he knew and who feared it. It's like Mrs. Pritchard's embroidery circle, Raymond. One loose thread can unravel the whole pattern, but you must find it first. Raymond smiled, a mix of amusement and admiration. You and your village parallels, Aunt Jane, but you're right, we need those records, and we need to verify Eleanor's whereabouts, Hale's stranger, and Carver's car. Finch's fear, too, there's something he's not saying. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her eyes distant. Fear is a great revealer, Raymond. Mr. Finch is afraid because he knows something, or saw something, that puts him at risk. Mrs. Winthrop hides her mourning because it touches a secret she can't share. Sergeant Hale's stranger may be a clue, or a distraction. And Mr. Carver, his smoothness is his armor, but armor has chinks. We must watch them all, and listen to what they don't say. The fire crackled, casting a warm glow across the parlor. Miss Marple set her knitting aside, her mind weaving the threads of motive into a tapestry that was still incomplete. The land dispute case, with its whispers of bribery, was the knot at the center, and she sensed that unraveling it would lead to the truth. As Raymond poured another cup of tea, she felt the familiar stir of anticipation. The killer was close, hidden in the ordinary details of village life, and she was determined to find them. Chapter 8. A crack in the Alabitha morning sun broke through the clouds over St. Mary Mead, casting a pale, clean light across the village's winding lanes. Miss Jane Marple, fortified by a breakfast of toast and marmalade at the vicarage, set out for the courthouse with a determined air. Her black lace mittens gripped her knitting bag, and her sensible hat shielded her eyes from the glare. The investigation into Judge Harold Winthrop's murder was gaining momentum, and today's task was to test the alibis that had begun to fray like poorly spun wool. Inspector Raymond West walked beside her, his stride brisk, his notebook tucked under his arm. The courthouse loomed ahead, its stone facade a silent witness to the secrets it held. Miss Marple had suggested a return to the scene, not to re-examine the judge's chambers, but to explore the spaces around it: the clerk's office, the courtyard, the corridors where the suspects moved. People leave traces, Raymond, she had said over tea the previous evening, not just in what they say, but in where they've been. A footprint, a glance, a moment's absence, they all tell a story. Raymond, though skeptical of her methods, had learned to trust her instincts, and so they began with Timothy Finch, whose nervous demeanor hinted at more than mere shock. The clerk's office was as orderly as ever, its filing cabinets standing like sentinels against the walls. Timothy Finch was already at his desk, sorting papers with a mechanical precision that belied the faint tremor in his hands. His spectacles glinted as he looked up, his face paling at the sight of Raymond and Miss Marple. "Inspector," he said, his voice high and strained, "I wasn't expecting you so soon." Raymond offered a reassuring nod, settling into a chair across from Finch. "We're just clarifying a few points. Mr. Finch, your account of yesterday morning, let's go over it again. You mentioned stepping out to the stationery cupboard. Can you be precise about the time and how long you were gone?" Finch's fingers twitched, brushing the ink-stained cuff of his shirt. "It was around 10:30, I think," he said, his eyes darting to the clock on the wall. "I needed paper clips and some foolscap. The cupboard's just down the hall, so I was gone no more than a minute or two. I came straight back." Miss Marple, seated near the door, began to knit, her needles clicking softly. She noted the hesitation in Finch's voice, the way his gaze avoided Raymond's. She recalled the caretaker, Mr. Gibbs, mentioning that Finch had been seen leaving the courthouse entirely that morning, heading toward the village square with a parcel under his arm. The stationery cupboard story was plausible, but it didn't account for a longer absence. Her needles moved steadily, a counterpoint to the clerk's unease. Raymond's tone remained calm, but probing. "A minute or two, you say? Did you see anyone in the corridor? Sergeant Hale, perhaps, or a visitor?" Finch shook his head, his spectacles slipping slightly. "No one. The corridor was empty. Hale was at his post when I left, but I didn't see him when I returned. I was only gone a moment, Inspector." Miss Marple's lips pursed. The discrepancy was subtle, but significant. She made a mental note to ask Mr. Gibbs for more details about Finch's movements, perhaps cross-referencing with the stationer's records. A minute to the cupboard was one thing. A trip to the village was another, and it placed Finch outside the courthouse during the critical window of the murder. Raymond jotted a note, then shifted tack. "You mentioned the judge was demanding. Did he ever reprimand you, or threaten your position?" Finch's face tightened, a flicker of resentment crossing his features. "He was strict," he admitted, "but fair. If I made a mistake, he'd point it out sharply. Sometimes, lately, he was more irritable, especially about the land dispute case. But he never threatened to sack me. I did my job well, Inspector." Miss Marple's needles paused. Finch's resentment was palpable, but it lacked the heat of a motive for murder. His fear, she thought, stemmed from something else perhaps, something he had seen or overheard in the judge's chambers. She resolved to press him later, perhaps in a less formal setting. where his guard might slip. Raymond closed his notebook and stood. "Thank you, Mr. Finch. We'll speak again. Stay in the village." As they left the clerk's office, Miss Marple lingered in the corridor, her eyes scanning the polished floor. The stationery cupboard was indeed close, its door visible from the clerk's office. But the path to the courthouse exit was equally accessible. She noted a faint scuff mark near the staircase, the kind made by a hurried step. It might mean nothing, but she filed it away. A small piece in the puzzle. Their next stop was the Winthrop residence, where Raymond had arranged to speak with the cook, Mrs. Collins, to verify Eleanor Winthrop's alibi. The Georgian house was as imposing as before, its windows still curtained, its air one of subdued mourning. Mrs. Collins, a stout woman with flour-dusted hands, met them in the kitchen, a warm, cluttered space that contrasted sharply with the drawing room's austerity. She wiped her hands on her apron, her eyes wary but curious. "Mrs. Winthrop says she was gardening yesterday morning," Raymond began, his tone gentle. "Can you confirm that? Did you see her from the kitchen window?" Mrs. Collins hesitated, her fingers twisting the apron. "I was busy, Inspector, with the baking and all. I might have seen her in the garden, but I can't say for certain. She was in and out of the house, I know that. I heard the front door around 10, maybe, but I didn't look. She's often out in the mornings, likes her privacy." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, her eyes on the cook's hands. The hesitation was telling, as was the vague reference to Eleanor's comings and goings. She recalled Mrs. Bantry's sighting of Eleanor in the village square, near the post office, at 10 o'clock. The cook's uncertainty suggested Eleanor had not been in the garden, as claimed, and Miss Marple wondered what errand had taken the widow Al Wayand, why she concealed it. Raymond pressed gently. "Did Mrs. Winthrop seem upset or unusual yesterday? Any visitors, any calls?" Mrs. Collins shook her head. "She was quiet, as always. No visitors that I saw, but the telephone rang once, around 9. She took it in the study, behind closed doors. Didn't hear who it was, but she seemed brisk after. Left soon after, I think." Miss Marple's interest sharpened. A telephone call, followed by a hurried departure, was a thread worth pursuing. She made a mental note to ask Raymond to check the telephone exchange, which might reveal the caller's identity. The cook's observation, though vague, added weight to the suspicion that Eleanor's morning was not, as she described. Back at the courthouse, Raymond interviewed the stable boy, Tom, a lanky youth who tended the horses and swept the courtyard. Tom confirmed Hale's smoke break, noting it was a daily habit around 11, lasting 5 minutes, maybe 10. He also recalled seeing a dark car parked near the courthouse the previous evening, its driver obscured by the dusk. "Looked like Mr. Carver's car," Tom said, scratching his head. "Same shiny bumper, but I didn't see him, just the car." Miss Marple's needles slowed. The car sighting, now corroborated, cast doubt on Carver's claim of being at his office. She wondered if he had met someone at the courthouse. Perhaps the judge himself, in a conversation that set the stage for murder. The stable boy's memory was a valuable thread, and she urged Raymond to verify it with other witnesses. Perhaps the grocer who had first mentioned the car, as the day drew to a close. Miss Marple and Raymond returned to the vicarage, the weight of their findings settling between them. Over tea, Raymond spread his notes on the table, his voice tinged with frustration. Finch's trip to the village, Eleanor's missing morning, Hale's routine absence, Carver's car there, all cracks. Aunt Jane, but nothing solid yet. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her eyes thoughtful. "Cracks are where the light gets in. Raymond, Mr. Finch's absence suggests he saw something he fears to admit. Mrs. Winthrop's secrecy points to a hidden purpose, perhaps a meeting, perhaps a fear. Sergeant Hale's routine was exploited, I think, by someone who knew it well. And Mr. Carver, His car places him closer to the crime than he wants us to know. We must follow these threads and see where they lead." Raymond smiled, a mix of weariness and admiration. "You make it sound like a knitting pattern, Aunt Jane, with every stitch in place." "It is, my dear," she replied, her needles resuming their rhythm, "and every pattern has a flaw, if you know where to look." Chapter 9. The hidden clue. The morning air in St. Mary Mead carried a crisp bite, the kind that sharpened the senses and made the village's quaint rooftops gleam under a pale sun. Miss Jane Marple, bundled in her tweed coat and clutching her knitting bag, accompanied Inspector Raymond West back to the courthouse. The investigation into Judge Harold Winthrop's murder had reached a delicate juncture, where the threads of motive and opportunity were beginning to intertwine, yet the pattern remained elusive. Miss Marple's eyes, bright and unyielding, scanned the courthouse's stone facade as they approached, her mind alert for the small details that often unlocked the greatest secrets. Raymond had secured permission to re-examine the judge's chambers, a task he undertook with a mix of determination and frustration. "We've got alibis cracking left and right," he said as they climbed the staircase, his voice low to avoid the ears of passing clerks. "But no hard evidence. I'm hoping something in that room, something we missed, will point us to the killer." Miss Marple nodded, her lips pursed in thought. "It's the little things, Raymond," she said softly. "A misplaced paper, a mark no one noticed. People think they can cover their tracks, but they always leave something behind, like crumbs on a table." The judge's chambers were much as they had been on the day of the murder, though the body had been removed, and the air now held a sterile chill. The mahogany desk stood at the center, its surface still bearing the neat stack of papers, the silver inkstand, and the porcelain teacup, now empty but unwashed, its faint ring a silent testament to the judge's final moments. The letter opener, the murder weapon, was gone, secured as evidence, but its absence seemed to loom over the room, a ghost of the violence it had wrought. Miss Marple moved slowly, her steps deliberate as she surveyed the space. The bookshelves, lined with legal tomes, were undisturbed, their spines aligned with military precision. The curtains hung evenly, the window latched, confirming the absence of forced entry. She paused by the desk, her eyes drawn to a faint scratch near the inkstand, a thin, irregular line that marred the polished wood. It was barely noticeable, but to her, it was as loud as a shout. "Raymond," she said, pointing with a gloved finger, "this mark. It wasn't here by accident, was it?" Raymond crouched beside the desk, his brow furrowing as he examined the scratch. "Could be from the letter opener," he said, his voice thoughtful. "Maybe it was moved, or grabbed, in a hurry. The judge kept it right here, didn't he?" He gestured to a small brass stand, now empty. Where the opener had rested, Miss Marple's needles emerged from her bag, their soft clack a familiar rhythm as she considered the mark. "Yes," she murmured, "and a scratch like that suggests haste or carelessness. The killer took the opener, but not without leaving a trace. It's personal. Raymond, this was no stranger's act. Someone the judge knew, someone who stood close enough to seize his own weapon." Raymond straightened, his eyes scanning the desk. No struggle, though. The papers are neat, the teacup upright. Whoever did this was calm, or at least appeared so, until the moment they struck. Miss Marple's gaze shifted to the stack of papers, their edges aligned with unnerving precision. She recalled the single sheet, slightly askew, that she had noticed on her first visit, ensuing a draft ruling. She wondered if the killer had disturbed it in their haste. "May I?" she asked, gesturing to the papers. Raymond nodded, and she carefully lifted the top sheet, revealing a typed document dense with legal terms. It was the draft ruling for the land dispute case, annotated in the judge's precise hand. A paragraph was circled in pencil, its contents unreadable without closer inspection, but the mark itself was deliberate. He was focused on something specific, she said, handing the sheet to Raymond. Perhaps something dangerous. As Raymond read the document, Miss Marple turned her attention to the wastebin beside the desk, a small brass receptacle that had been overlooked in the initial search. She bent down, her movements careful, and sifted through its contents: crumpled notes, an empty envelope, and then, tucked beneath a sheet of blotting paper, a torn scrap. She retrieved it with a handkerchief, holding it to the light. The scrap bore the initials LC and a partial phone number, scrawled in a hurried hand. "Raymond," she called softly, extending the scrap, "this may be of interest." He took it, his eyes narrowing. L. Código. Lawrence Carver. And a phone number part of one. At least. He slipped the scrap into an evidence bag, his expression grim. This could place him in the room, or at least connect him to the judge that morning. Miss Marple's needles paused, her mind racing. The initials were damning, but the phone number intrigued her more. It was incomplete, ending in a jagged tear, as if someone had tried to destroy it. "It's curious, isn't it?" she said. "A note like that, discarded but not destroyed. Perhaps the killer was interrupted, or thought it insignificant." Raymond's jaw tightened. "I'll have the exchange trace the number, or what's left of it. If it's Carver's, he's got some explaining to do." They left the chambers, the scrap of paper and the scratch on the desk weighing heavily on their minds. Later at the vicarage, Raymond telephoned the exchange, reading out the partial number. The operator confirmed it matched the prefix for Carver's office, but the missing digits made certainty impossible. "It's something," Raymond said, hanging up, "but not enough." Miss Marple sat by the fire, her knitting in her lap, her eyes distant. "Mr. Carver is a careful man, Raymond, but even careful men make mistakes. That note suggests a connection, a meeting, perhaps, or a call. And the scratch on the desk, it speaks of a moment of urgency, a decision made in haste." Raymond paced the parlor, his frustration evident. "Carver's alibi is shaky, and now this." But Finch was in and out of the courthouse. Eleanor was in the village, and Hale was away from his post. Any of them could have been in that room. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. "Yes, but the letter opener points to intimacy, Raymond. It was the judge's own, taken from his desk. Mr. Carver, with his frequent visits, would have known it was there, and the land dispute case's client's future rested on the judge's ruling. A man like Carver, so polished, might act decisively to protect his interests." Raymond stopped pacing, his eyes narrowing. "You're leaning toward him, aren't you? But what about the others? Finch's fear, Eleanor's secrecy, Hale's absence." Miss Marple smiled faintly, her fingers steady. "They all have secrets, Raymond. Mr. Finch's fear may come from what he saw, not what he did. Mrs. Winthrop's absence suggests a personal matter, not necessarily murder. Sergeant Hale's lapse was careless, but without motive. It's just a mistake. Mr. Carver, though his motive is clear, his opportunity possible. We must find the thread that ties him to the moment." Raymond sighed, a wry smile breaking through. "You and your threads, Aunt Jane. But you're right, we need more. I'll push for those court records and check Carver's car again. That note's a start, but we need proof." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed, her mind weaving the clues into a pattern. "Proof is in the details, my dear. A scratch, a note, a moment's haste, they're all part of the story. We're close, Raymond, very close." As the fire crackled, Miss Marple resumed her knitting, the rhythm of her needles mirroring the steady unraveling of the mystery. The hidden clue had brought them nearer to the truth, and she sensed the final pieces were within reach. Chapter 10. The Judge's Secret. The morning mist clung to St. Mary Mead, wrapping the village in a gauzy veil that softened the outlines of its cottages and lanes. Miss Jane Marple, undeterred by the damp, made her way to the courthouse with Inspector Raymond West, her sensible boots clicking on the wet cobbles. Her knitting bag swung gently at her side, a quiet companion to her thoughts, which were as sharp and focused as ever. The investigation into Judge Harold Winthrop's murder had reached a critical point, where the threads of suspicion woven from alibis, motives, and a single torn scrap of paper were beginning to form a clearer pattern. Today, Miss Marple sensed, would bring them closer to the heart of the mystery. The courthouse was quieter than usual, its corridors hushed as if holding their breath. Raymond had received the court records he'd requested, a thick bundle of documents tied with string, delivered by a harried clerk who muttered about the judge's meticulous filing system. They settled in a small reading room adjacent to the library, its walls lined with faded maps and legal notices, the air heavy with the scent of dust and old paper. Raymond spread the records on a table, his expression a mix of anticipation and wariness. "These should tell us what the judge was working on," he said, untying the bundle. "If there's a motive in that land dispute case, it's in here." Miss Marple took a seat, her knitting needles emerging with their familiar soft clack. She watched Raymond's hands move through the papers, her eyes alert for any detail that might shift the puzzle's pieces into place. The records were dense, with legal jargon affidavits, depositions, and correspondence related to the land dispute case involving Mr. Carson, the developer whose ambitions had stirred unrest in the village. But one document caught her attention, a handwritten memo, tucked between typed pages, in the judge's precise script. It was dated 2 days before his death, and its contents were startling. Raymond read it aloud, his voice low but steady. "It's a note to the court registrar," he said. "The judge writes, 'I have reason to suspect Mr. Lawrence Carver of improperly sharing privileged information with his client, Mr. Carson, regarding the land dispute case. Evidence suggests attempts to influence the court's decision through financial inducements. I intend to address this in my ruling and recommend an investigation.'" Miss Marple's needles paused, her lips pursing slightly. "That's a dangerous secret, Raymond," she said softly. "If the judge suspected Mr. Carver of corruption, it would ruin his career, perhaps even lead to criminal charges. And Mr. Carson, his development would be halted, his fortune at risk. This memo is a motive, clear as day." Raymond's eyes narrowed, his fingers tightening on the paper. Carver knew the judge was onto him, didn't he? That scrap of paper with his initials, the car sighting, his shaky alibi, it's all starting to add up. Miss Marple nodded, her mind turning over the implications. The memo confirmed what she had suspected. The land dispute case was the heart of the murder, its stakes high enough to drive a man to violence. Carver's polished exterior, his frequent visits to the judge's chambers, the raised voices overheard by Finch and Halal, pointed to a confrontation brewing, but she cautioned herself against haste. "It's strong, Raymond, but we need more. The memo shows motive, but we must place him in the chambers at the time of the murder." Raymond leafed through the remaining documents, his frustration mounting. "There's nothing else here, no direct evidence, no witnesses, but I'll have Carver brought in again. That memo, combined with the scrap of paper, is enough to shake him." Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythm, her eyes distant. "Be careful, Raymond. Mr. Carver is clever, and clever men don't crumble easily. He'll have an explanation for the memo, for the note. We need something he can't explain, always something physical, or a witness who saw him." They left the reading room and headed to the village, where Raymond had arranged to meet a junior clerk, Miss Clara Reed, who had worked under Finch and occasionally assisted the judge. Clara, a shy young woman with mousy hair and a nervous smile, met them at the tea shop, its windows steamed from the morning's baking. She clutched a cup of tea, her eyes darting between Raymond and Miss Marple, as if unsure of her role. "Miss Reed," Raymond began, his tone gentle, "you were in the courthouse the morning of the murder. Did you see or hear anything unusual, particularly involving Mr. Carver or the judge?" Clara's fingers tightened on her cup, her voice barely above a whisper. I was filing in the records room, mostly, but I did see Mr. Carver the day before, in the judge's chambers. They were talking, arguing. Really? I couldn't hear much, but the judge sounded angry. Something about ethics and consequences. Mr. Carver left in a huff, his face all red. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, her eyes fixed on Clara's face. The argument was significant, corroborating Hale's and Finch's accounts of tension between the judge and Carver. She leaned forward slightly, her voice warm and encouraging. That's very helpful, Miss Reed. Did you see Mr. Carver at the courthouse the next morning, perhaps near the judge's chambers? Clara hesitated, her eyes dropping to her tea. I'm not sure. I was in the records room most of the morning, but I stepped out to fetch some ink around 11. I thought I saw someone in a dark coat near the chambers, but it was just a glance. It could have been Mr. Carver, but I wouldn't swear to it. Miss Marple's lips curved in a faint smile. Clara's uncertainty was honest, but the detail of the dark coat matched Carver's usual attire, a charcoal suit that stood out in the courthouse's muted tones. She made a mental note to cross-check with other staff, perhaps the cleaner who swept the corridors that morning. You've done well to remember, my dear, she said. Even a glance can be important. Raymond jotted a note, his expression thoughtful. Thank you, Miss Reed. If you recall anything else, come to me directly. As Clara nodded and hurried away, he turned to Miss Marple, his voice low, another thread pointing to Carver. That argument, the memo, the Kotits, building Aunt Jane. Miss Marple's needles slowed, her mind weaving the new information into the pattern. Yes, Raymond, but we must be thorough. Mr. Carver's motive is clear, and his presence is likely, but we need certainty. The judge's secret threatened him, and men like Carver act when cornered. But we must find the moment, the exact moment he entered that room. Back at the vicarage, over a simple supper of soup and bread, Raymond outlined his plan. I'll bring them all in, tomorrow. Finch, Eleanor, Hale, Carver. Lay out what we've got, and see who cracks. The memos are leverage, and that scrap of paper ties Carver to the scene. Miss Marple sipped her soup, her eyes thoughtful. A confrontation may shake them, Raymond, but be mindful. Mr. Carver will deflect, Mrs. Winthrop will withdraw, Mr. Finch will tremble, and Sergeant Hale will bristle. Watch their eyes, their hands. The truth hides in what they don't say. Raymond smiled, a mix of exasperation and admiration. You make it sound like a chess game, Aunt Jane, with every move calculated. It is, my dear, she replied, her needles clicking once more. And we're nearing checkmate, if we play our pieces right. As the fire flickered, Miss Marple's mind turned to the confrontation ahead. The judge's secret had cast a long shadow, and she sensed the killer was within reach, hidden in the interplay of fear, ambition, and betrayal. Chapter 11. The Confrontation, the Courthouse Library, in St. Mary Mead, with its high ceilings and heavy oak shelves, had never felt more like a stage set for a reckoning. The late morning light streamed through the tall windows, casting stark shadows across the long mahogany table where the four suspects sat, summoned by Inspector Raymond West for a final reckoning. The air was thick with tension, the faint scent of old books mingling with the sharper tang of anticipation. Miss Jane Marple stood quietly near a bookcase, her knitting bag at her side, her needles clicking softly as she observed the scene with eyes that missed nothing. The truth, she knew, was close, hidden in the interplay of glances and silences now gathered in this room. Raymond stood at the head of the table, his notebook open, his demeanor calm but resolute. The suspects Timothy Finch, Eleanor Winthrop, Sergeant Robert Hale, and Lawrence Carver sat in uneasy proximity, their faces a study in contrasts. Finch's nervous fidgeting, Eleanor's icy composure, Hale's gruff discomfort, and Carver's polished calm. Each had been called to hear the latest findings, though Raymond had kept the details vague, hoping to unsettle them into revealing more. "Thank you for coming," Raymond began, his voice steady. "We've made progress in Judge Winthrop's murder investigation, and I need to clarify certain points. Each of you was close to the judge, and each of you has gaps in your account of that morning. Let's start with the facts." Miss Marple's needles moved rhythmically, her gaze shifting from one suspect to another. She noted Finch's trembling hands, clutching a handkerchief as if it were a lifeline. Eleanor sat rigid, her black dress a stark contrast to her pale face, her eyes fixed on a point beyond Raymond. Hale's broad shoulders were hunched, his fingers tapping a restless rhythm on the table. Carver, alone among them, appeared at ease, his hands folded, his smile faint but unwavering. Yet Miss Marple saw the slight tightening of his jaw, a telltale sign of strain beneath the polished dot. Raymond held up the torn scrap of paper, now sealed in an evidence bag. "We found this in the judge's waistband," he said, his tone measured. "It bears the initials LC and a partial phone number traced to Mr. Carver's office. This places you, Mr. Carver, in connection with the judge's final hours. Care to explain?" Carver's smile didn't falter, though his eyes flickered briefly. "A misunderstanding, Inspector," he said smoothly. "I often left notes for Harold case, updates, reminders. That scrap could be from any meeting, days or weeks ago. As for the phone number, many people have my office line. It proves nothing." Miss Marple's needles paused. Carver's response was too quick, too polished, like a line rehearsed for a courtroom. She recalled the junior clerk, Clara Reed, mentioning an argument between Carver and the judge the day before the murder, heated words about ethics and consequences. The scrap, combined with the judge's memo suspecting Carver of corruption, painted a damning picture. But Carver's confidence suggested he believed himself untouchable. Raymond pressed on, producing the judge's memo. "This is more troubling, Mr. Carver. The judge wrote that he suspected you of sharing privileged information with your client, Mr. Carson, in the land dispute case. He planned to address it in his ruling and recommend an investigation. That's a motive, sir, a strong one." The room stilled, the weight of the accusation settling like dust. Finch's eyes widened, his handkerchief twisting in his hands. Eleanor's gaze flickered to Carver, a flash of something, curiosity, perhaps, or recognition crossing her face. Hale's tapping stopped, his expression darkening. Carver, however, leaned back, his smile thinning but intact. "A grave accusation, Inspector," he said, his voice cool. "Harold was mistaken. I shared nothing improper with Carson. That memo is speculation, not evidence. I'd have welcomed an investigation to clear my name." Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. Carver's deflection was masterful, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of unease, a crack in his armor. She turned her attention to the others, testing their reactions. "Mr. Finch," she said softly, her voice cutting through the tension. "You were in and out of the courthouse that morning. Did you see Mr. Carver near the judge's chambers, perhaps delivering a note?" Finch started, his spectacles slipping down his nose. I don't know," he stammered, his voice high. "I was busy fetching stationery, as I said. I didn't see Mr. Carver, not then. I swear it." Miss Marple noted the panic in his voice, the way his eyes darted to Carver before dropping to his lap. Finch's fear was palpable, but it was not the fear of a killer, it was the fear of a man caught in a lie, or perhaps protecting one. She recalled the caretaker's sighting of Finch in the village square, far from the stationery cupboard, and wondered what he had truly been doing. Raymond turned to Eleanor. "Mrs. Winthrop, you claimed to be gardening, but witnesses place you in the village at 10 o'clock. Where were you, and why hide it?" Eleanor's face hardened, her hands clenching in her lap. "I told you, Inspector, I was at home," she said, her voice like ice. "If someone saw me in the village, they're mistaken. I had no reason to be at the courthouse, and no reason to harm my husband." Miss Marple's needles clicked faster, her eyes on Eleanor's hands. The widow's composure was formidable, but the clench of her fingers betrayed a struggle to maintain it. She recalled Mrs. Collins, the cook, mentioning a telephone call that morning, followed by Eleanor's departure. Was it connected to the judge's death, or a private matter she guarded fiercely? Miss Marple made a mental note to pursue the call's origin. Perhaps through the village's nosy telephone operator. Raymond's gaze shifted to Hale. "Sergeant, your smoke break left the judge's door unguarded. You mentioned a stranger in the courtyard the evening before. Could it have been Mr. Carver, perhaps meeting the judge?" Hale's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing. "I told you, it was too dark to see clearly," he said gruffly. "Could have been anyone. I didn't see Mr. Carver at the courthouse that morning. Not during my break." Miss Marple noted the defensiveness in Hale's tone, the way his eyes avoided Carver's. His loyalty to the judge was evident, but his reluctance to elaborate on the stranger suggested he was withholding something, perhaps out of habit or fear. She resolved to speak with the stable boy again, whose memory of a dark car might shed light on the evening's visitor. Raymond set down the memo, his voice firm. The judge's ruling threatened Mr. Carson's millions and Mr. Carver's reputation. The letter opener, taken from the judge's desk, suggests a killer he trusted, someone who stood close. "Mr. Carver, you were seen arguing with him the day before, and your car was spotted at the courthouse that evening. The evidence points to you." Carver's smile vanished, replaced by a cold intensity. "You're building a case on scraps and whispers, Inspector," he said, his voice low. "I wasn't there. I had no reason to kill Harold. He was my colleague, my friend." Miss Marple leaned forward, her voice gentle but piercing. "And yet, Mr. Carver, the judge suspected you of betrayal. That memo, that note with your initials, they suggest a confrontation. You visited him that morning, didn't you? To plead your case, perhaps, but it turned to violence when he refused to yield." Carver's face drained of color, his hands gripping the table's edge. For a moment, silence hung heavy, broken only by the faint clack of Miss Marple's needles. Then he rose, his voice trembling with controlled fury. "This is absurd. I demand to speak to my own counsel." Raymond nodded, his expression unreadable. "You'll have that chance, sir. For now, you're not to leave the village." As the suspects dispersed, Finch hurrying out, Eleanor gliding with icy grace, Hale lumbering, and Carver stalking away. With a forced calm, Miss Marple remained, her knitting folded in her lap. Raymond joined her, his voice low. Carver's rattled. "Aunt Jane." That memo hit him hard. Miss Marple's eyes gleamed. "Yes, Raymond. He's cornered, and cornered men make mistakes. But we must be sure. The others have secrets too, and we must untangle them before we close the net." As they left the library, the courthouse clock chimed noon, its echo a reminder that time was pressing. The confrontation had laid bare the killer's shadow, and Miss Marple knew the final truth was within reach. Chapter 12. Justice served. The afternoon sun hung low over St. Mary Mead, bathing the village in a golden glow that softened the edges of its quiet lanes and thatched roofs. The courthouse, however, stood resolute, its stone facade unmoved by the day's warmth, a silent guardian of the secrets it had held for generations. Inside, the library was once again the stage for a final gathering, though the air now carried a weight of inevitability. Miss Jane Marple, her knitting bag at her side, stood near the tall windows, her eyes sharp behind her spectacles as she watched the four suspects: Timothy Finch, Eleanor Winthrop, Sergeant Robert Hale, and Lawrence Carver, take their seats around the mahogany table. The soft clack of her needles punctuated the silence, a steady rhythm that seemed to measure the pulse of the truth about to unfold. Inspector Raymond West stood at the head of the table, his posture firm, his notebook closed for once, as if the facts were now so clear they needed no further record. The investigation into Judge Harold Winthrop's murder had reached its climax. the threads of motive, opportunity, and evidence woven into a pattern that pointed to one inescapable conclusion. Yet Raymond, ever cautious, had agreed to let Miss Marple lead this final confrontation, trusting her ability to unravel the human heart with a precision no police manual could teach. "Thank you for coming," Raymond began, his voice calm but commanding. "We've gathered the evidence, and we know who killed Judge Winthrop. But before we act, we owe it to justice to lay out the truth." Miss Marple's needles slowed, her gaze moving from one suspect to another. Finch sat hunched, his hands twisting a handkerchief, his spectacles glinting with nervous sweat. Eleanor's face was a mask of icy control, her black dress stark against her pale skin, though her fingers betrayed a faint tremor. Hale's broad frame was tense, his ruddy cheeks flushed, his eyes fixed on the table as if avoiding scrutiny. Carver, alone among them, maintained an air of composure, his suit immaculate, his smile faint but defiant. Yet Miss Marple saw the strain in his eyes, a flicker of fear beneath the polish. She stepped forward, her voice gentle but piercing, like a needle threading through fabric. "The judge's death was no random act," she began, her eyes sweeping the room. "It was personal, committed by someone he trusted, someone who stood close enough to take his own letter opener and use it against him. The evidence, the scratch on the desk, the torn note, the judge's memo points to a truth we can no longer ignore." Finch's head jerked up, his voice a squeak. "I didn't do it, Miss Marple. I swear, I was just fetching stationery." Miss Marple raised a hand, her expression kind but firm. "Mr. Finch, your fear has been clear from the start. You were not in the clerk's office all morning, as you claimed. Mr. Gibbs saw you in the village square, carrying a parcel. You were afraid, not of guilt, but of what you saw or heard. Isn't that so?" Finch's face crumpled, his handkerchief falling to the table. I saw Mr. Carver," he admitted, his voice barely audible. "That morning, near the judge's chambers. I was coming back from the stationer's, and I saw him in the corridor, looking furtive. I didn't think much of it then, but after, I was afraid to say." Miss Marple nodded, her needles resuming their rhythm. "Thank you, Mr. Finch. Your fear was understandable, but the truth is always better brought to light." She turned to Eleanor, whose eyes had widened slightly at Finch's confession. "Mrs. Winthrop, your alibi was also false. You were not gardening, as you claimed. Mrs. Bantry saw you in the village, and Mrs. Collins confirmed you left the house after a telephone call. You were protecting a secret, weren't you? Not murder, but something personally meeting, perhaps, that you couldn't reveal." Eleanor's lips parted, a flash of defiance crossing her face before she sighed, her shoulders sagging. "Yes," she said quietly. "I was meeting a friend, someone Harold disapproved of. It was a private matter. I didn't want it dragged into this. I had no reason to harm my husband." Miss Marple's eyes softened, though her voice remained steady. "I believe you, Mrs. Winthrop. Your secret was your own, but it clouded the truth. You've helped us by clearing it now." She turned to Hale, whose hands had clenched into fists. "Sergeant Hale, your smoke break left the judge vulnerable, but it was no accident, was it? You were drawn away, perhaps by a distraction someone. Who knew your habits? Your loyalty to the judge was genuine, but your absence was exploited." Hale's jaw tightened, his voice gruff. "I didn't mean to leave him unguarded. I saw that stranger the night before. Like I said, might have been a trick to test my routine. I should have stayed at my post." Miss Marple nodded, her gaze shifting to Carver, whose smile had vanished, replaced by a cold intensity. "Mr. Carver," she said, her voice cutting through the room's tension, "the evidence points to you. The judge's memo suspected you of sharing privileged information with Mr. Carson, threatening your career and his fortune. The scrap of paper with your initials, the sighting of your car, the argument Clara Reed overheard about ethics and consequences, they all place you in the chambers in a moment of desperation. Carver rose, his voice sharp. This is preposterous, Miss Marple. I was in my office, as I told you. That memo is speculation. That note could be anyone's, and the car sighting is a mistake. You have no proof. Miss Marple's needles stopped, her eyes locking onto his. No proof, you say? But there's the scratch on the desk, Mr. Carver, where you grabbed the letter opener in haste, and Mr. Finch's testimony, placing you in the corridor. You went to the judge that morning, didn't you? To plead your case, to beg him to reconsider his ruling. But when he accused you of corruption, when he refused to yield, your desperation turned to rage. The room fell silent, the weight of her words pressing down. Carver's face drained of color, his hands gripping the table's edge. For a moment, he seemed poised to argue, but then his shoulders slumped, and he sank back into his chair, his voice a broken whisper. I didn't mean to. It wasn't planned. I went to talk, to explain, but he called me a traitor, said he'd ruin me. I saw the opener, and I just acted. Raymond stepped forward, his voice firm. Lawrence Carver, you're under arrest for the murder of Judge Harold Winthrop. He signaled to a constable, who moved to escort Carver from the room. The lawyer rose, his composure shattered, his eyes hollow as he was led away. Finch buried his face in his hands. Eleanor stared blankly ahead, and Hale muttered a curse under his breath. Miss Marple folded her knitting, her expression serene, but tinged with sorrow. The truth had been uncovered, but it brought no joy, only the quiet satisfaction of justice. Later, at the vicarage, Raymond poured tea, his expression a mix of relief and awe. You did it, Aunt Jane. You saw through Carver's facade when I was still chasing shadows. Miss Marple smiled faintly, her needles clicking once more. Human nature, Raymond, is the real mystery. Mr. Carver was clever, but his ambition betrayed him. People always leave traces, my dear, in their words, their fears, their mistakes. You just have to know where to look. As the fire crackled, St. Mary Mead settled back into its tranquil rhythm, the courthouse once again a place of order. But Miss Marple knew the village's quiet hid countless stories, and she would be ready when the next one needed unraveling.